So this is my starting code. We've got app component. Here we have two fields, cuisines and restaurants. They both are Firebase list observable objects. And ng on init, we simply get the list of cuisines and restaurants. So nothing fancy. Now in our template, we simply display the list of cuisines and restaurants using ng4 directive. When you run this application, this is what you're going to see. Now in the list of restaurants, I want to display the cuisine type next to each restaurant. And this is the structure that I showed you in the last lecture. So to render the list of restaurants and their cuisine type, I'm going to get all the restaurants first. And then for each restaurant, I'm going to look at its cuisine. I find a number, and then I'm going to create a new property in that restaurant at runtime. Let's call it cuisine type. And that cuisine type is going to be an observable that points to that actual cuisine node in our Firebase database. Now let's get to the implementation. So here in app component, after calling the list method, I'm going to apply the map operator of observables. So dot map. But you see, it's not recognized by TypeScript compiler. So we need to import this operator on the top. Import rxjs add operator map. Okay, in the map method, we're going to get an array of restaurants. So restaurants goes to. And for now, I just want to display this on the console. So console.log. I add a label before map because I want you to see exactly how I'm going to transform this array. So before map, restaurants. And then finally, I'm going to return this restaurants back. Now we have a red underline here because what we get from the map method is the standard observable object. But our restaurants field is a Firebase list observable. So to fix that, we need to change this type to observable. Now we need to import this type from rxjs. So import observable from rxjs/observable. Okay, so far so good. Save, back to the browser. All right, look at the console. So this is the array that we get from our observable. Every time we modify the restaurants node in Firebase, like adding a restaurant, updating an existing one, or removing one, we get a new array. Now, if you look at this array, each object has a $key property, which represents the key of our restaurant. And below that, we've got the additional properties that belong to each restaurant, like address, cuisine, features, name, and rating. Now look at cuisine. It's a number, and that's the key of a cuisine node in our database. I'm going to use this to create a new observable that points to that node. So back in our component, after console.log, I'm going to call restaurants.map. Now this is the tricky part. This map method here is the map method implemented on the array type, not observable. With this, I'm going to get a restaurant. And here I'm going to slightly modify it before returning it. So it's like iterating over this restaurants array and modifying each element. So here, I'm going to add a new property to each restaurant. Let's call it cuisine type. And this is going to be an observable. So this, .angularfire, .database, .object. For the location, I'm going to use /cuisines, /. And here I want to add the key of that cuisine, which is restaurant.cuisine. So we simply get an observable and store it in cuisine type. Now we go to our template. Next to each restaurant, I'm going to display its cuisine type. So string interpolation, r.cuisine type Now this is an observable, so we need to apply async pipe. Like this. Now when this cuisine type is ready, I'm going to display its $value property. Because as you remember, these cuisines are simple name value pairs. Okay? Save. Now one last step before we look at the result. Before returning the array of restaurants, I want to log in on the console one more time. So console.log after map. Save. Back to the browser. Okay, here's after map. Let's take a look. Note that in addition to cuisine, now we have a new property, cuisine type, which is an observable. So that's how I modified each restaurant at runtime. And now let's look at the result. You can see next to each restaurant, we've got their cuisine type: Italian, Spanish, and Thai. Now, you might be a little bit skeptical about this approach, thinking that it's going to cause some overhead. Well, that's true to some extent, because we're doing additional reads from the database. However, NoSQL databases, and especially Firebase, is optimized for these kind of reads. Plus, Firebase SDK, which we're using in our project, has a client part. So as it reads these objects from the server, it caches them. In this example, we have got 2 Thai restaurants. But our Firebase client is going to issue only one read from the server. Once it discovers a cuisine with that ID, it's not going to read it again. So our Firebase client is always in sync with the server. It's notified when the data on the server is changed, and then it updates its data automatically. The good thing is we don't have to worry about any of this complexity. Next, we're going to look at a more complex example of joining data across multiple nodes.